Good evening. My name is Caitlin Miller, and I'm the Director of Education at Planet Word, which you can see behind me. I am so pleased to welcome you tonight to this virtual program. I'm sure that an amazing conversation is in store. Planet Word is pleased to present a variety of public programming in both virtual and in-person settings to help people celebrate and think more deeply about the ways words, language, and reading shape our lives. Now, these programs are only made possible through the support of people like you who donate to or become members of Planet Word. The holidays are right around the corner, and it is possible that a membership to Planet Word is just the thing someone special in your life needs. But tonight, I'm very excited to get this program kicked off. Allow me to introduce our guests. Ilan Stavans is the editor of The People's Tongue, Americans in the English Language, and the moderator of our series of programs of the same name. Ilan is the Lewis-Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. Ilan is joined in conversation by Emily Wilson. Emily is a classicist, author, translator, and professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2018, she became the first woman to publish an English translation of Homer's Odyssey. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Caitlin. Emily, it's a pleasure to now see you.
Yes, now I figured out how to put my video on. Yes, good for me. Yes.
In being dialogue, really looking forward to it. I've been an admirer of your astonishing work as a translator and as a scholar for years, and the opportunity of asking you questions and engaging you in a dialogue is thrilling. I want to go in different directions in our conversation, mostly about your relationship to language, your relationship to the texts that you translate, and to the receiving language, English. But along the way, I want to explore your own life, your own connection with the authors that you translate, with your students, with the readers in general. So let me start with this question, Emily. How would you define the relationship that you have to English on the one hand, in comparison with the Greek of the authors that you translate, Homer and Sophocles and Euripides and the others that you have done? What is that? How do you see those two languages in your life?
That's such a great and such a difficult question. I mean, I think one thing, how do we define any relationship, especially a very long-standing and deep and intimate relationship, like the relationships we all have with languages that we spend many, many hours and days and years with, as I've done with both ancient Greek and Latin, and with, of course, the English language. I mean, I think one thing I would say is that I cared very, very deeply about all three of these languages, and including the ancient ones and, of course, my mother tongue, English. And I care about all of them as literary languages as well. I mean, I think some classicists have a much more distant relationship to English as a literary language than I do, because I really care about the long history of English poetry. And we just were talking before the recording started about the fact that my mother was a Shakespearean, and from a young age I was sort of immersed in English poetry, and the idea of English as a poetic language, as well as the idea of ancient languages as potentially literary and poetic, as well as languages that, of course, people in antiquity were just speaking in those languages too. So I mean, I'm fascinated by language in general, and to me, part of what was exciting about first learning ancient languages was that it gave me a new way of thinking about my own language in a sort of more distanced way. I mean, you can get a different perspective on the language that you've grown up speaking and reading once you learn another one, and once you learn more ways of thinking about language, talking about language in sort of structured ways, as well as just inhabiting it in the way that a fish inhabits water.
So what are some of those things that you learned about English as a result of your exposure to ancient Greek and Latin? What different perspective did you acquire, or have you acquired along the way?
I mean, partly just the sort of very might seem like it's too obvious to talk about, but just the sort of technicalities of English doesn't have a dual. I never thought about why do we just have singular and plural? We don't have a dual. What's up with that? Why does Greek have all these particles that express tone of voice, whereas English, I mean, if you're writing in English or speaking in English, you might say, indeed, yes, verily, I totally think this. You have to insert a lot of adverbs, whereas in Greek, including Homeric Greek, these terms like dare and man and like these particles, like these tiny words, which are some of the most common words in any Greek text, are going to be these little, just adding emphasis or tone of voice kinds of words. And I mean, even also just the ways that word order matters so much in English, which I hadn't really thought about before I started learning Latin and ancient Greek, which is so much more highly inflected. So you can mess with word order in different ways if you're writing in Latin from the ways that you can in English.
You've said in a number of places, Emily, that you first encountered the Homeric texts in high school, and that you have returned to them so many times, and your relationship with them has been transformed. And now you have the opportunity of presenting it to college students. I mean, you've been doing it for over 20 years at UPenn. What is the difference in terms, how do you see, let me stop there for a second. How do you see the young generation, your students, being interested in the classics and in the Greek and Latin classics? What are the hurdles that a professor has to make them accessible, to make them appealing? There's so much that you do in your translations to make them appealing and accessible and urgent. And I'll go there, but I want to know about your strategies introducing them to this young generation that is coming to the fore.
I mean, I think it's a sort of internal question, and it's hard to come up with a sort of single answer about that. I mean, part of it is just getting them through the door to start with, right? I mean, there are so many kids in college who I think wouldn't necessarily think I can sign up for a classics class, even if it's a class of literature read in translation or ancient history, where you don't need to learn any Latin or ancient Greek, but just sort of reassuring students, this is for you, whether or not you went to a high school where they did some Latin, or whether or not you know how to say Diomedes or pronounce anything, this is for you. It's not for just a particular category of student, it's for everyone. So getting them through the door in the first place, I think, is one of the big hurdles, because I think there's so much preconception that classics is this esoteric thing, which is also, of course, even just the term classics, it suggests a sort of classism, it suggests a kind of snobbery, it suggests a sort of, segregation along lines of whiteness and privilege, which I think is very, very difficult to unpick. I mean, I think there's a much longer conversation to have about that whole really toxic history of the discipline of classical studies and how to get kids through the door. I think once they are through the door, it's actually not that hard to make anyone from any background interested in these stories and these characters. I mean, I think there are other questions about, how do you enable students to have an idea about either history or literature that's more nuanced than just, I like that guy, I don't like that guy, or this is what happened, this is what didn't happen. There's this sort of binary attitude that many kids sort of straight out of high school have about, this is how we read literature or history, as it's either true or false, or it's either this guy's right or that guy's right, or this is the one I relate to. And then you can start a conversation from there. If that's where they are, you can start a conversation from there and sort of dig into, maybe the depiction of Achilles is more complicated than just he's either good or bad. Maybe there's something else going on in the text beyond that. But I think if you can start with just having students realize these are really compelling characters expressing really intense emotions, that's interesting. And then you can start to pick into, so how does the text represent those things, and what's going on in this society and this poem that might be both like and unlike things we can recognize.
Now, I want to focus most of our conversation in the Homeric texts, and let me ask you now. The first one that you did was the Odyssey, and then you went 6 years later. I think published 5 years later, but you started before with 6 years to the Iliad. In the introduction to the Iliad, you say you like very much the Odyssey, but it's the Iliad that you really feel close to. Why that order? What was it? Was it easier to sell the Odyssey to a publisher? Was it easier to make your way through a text that you don't love that much, because then you're going to get to the one that you really love?
I love the Odyssey. I don't want to pretend I don't love it. I mean, I love all of them very, very much. I mean, I think maybe one thing I'd say is that was not my first published translation. The first published translations I did were of Seneca's tragedies, which I also love. And I mean, I think it's actually important to start there because both because it sort of says something about the marketing of translation that people don't necessarily think about, which is that I was approached to do all of the translations I published. It wasn't that I sort of had a dream and then my dream was realized when an editor happened to have the same dream. It was that the editor had the dream and suggested it to me. And then I came up with a book proposal after that. But it wasn't my idea about any of these. I started with Seneca because I'd written about Seneca so much. So I'd written about Seneca a lot in my dissertation, which became my first book, which is about the long history of tragedy. And that had 2 chapters about Seneca, an author that I also wrote another standalone book about, whom I'm kind of obsessed with. I mean, I guess I kind of want to flag that because I think people think of me as a translator from ancient Greek and also rather than Latin, and also as somebody who's interested in clarity and not so much bombast. Seneca is super bombastic, and I love that. And it's melodramatic, and it includes all the Latin includes lots of literary allusions to earlier Latin poetry, which are qualities that I wanted to try to convey in my translation by including lots of quotations to earlier English poetry in the translation. So sort of using the longer heritage of English to convey this is how Seneca quotes from Ovid and Virgil. So, I mean, I think in a way, part of where I was coming from in translating Homer was thinking, I don't want to make Homer sound like Seneca. I've already done Seneca, I love Seneca. And Homer doesn't sound anything like that. It's not elusive, it's not show off in quite those ways. And I love it when language shows off, but this is not how Homer sounds. So the Norton, which is the publisher for both my Odyssey translation and the Iliad, I got to know an editor there and several editors there because I was involved in the Norton Anthology of World Literature. And for the Anthology of World Literature, we had the whole of the Odyssey and only part of the Iliad, partly because if you're going to teach an intro to world literature, the Odyssey is, for very, very obvious reasons, the one you might go for, because it includes more of the world. The Iliad has a much tighter, more confined setting where, if you think the whole world is about the mortal human body and the battlefield, then it's the whole world, but it's not spreading out all across at least the Mediterranean or beyond, where the Odyssey is. I mean, I don't want to sort of present myself as only an Iliad person, but I love both.
Do you feel once you see a translation that you've done published, Emily, and you're rereading it or you're teaching it, do you feel the temptation to change it?
All the time, yes. Yes, I do. Yes,
and
all the time.
Change it in new print, in reprints, or do you not again?
I do whenever the publisher lets me. Yes, I do. I think they hate me for that. It's terrible. Whenever I go back and reread, or if I'm teaching either a part or all of it, or I do a public reading and I read aloud a little bit, I almost always think, oh, I would kind of like to change that word or that word or that word, and I don't like that verbal repetition, or that sound doesn't sound quite right, or that the rhythm in that line isn't quite right. I have long lists of required or desired edits for everything. Whenever I get the chance, I want to mess with it. Yeah.
Paul Valéry once said that a poem is never finished; it's only abandoned.
Absolutely.
Do you think the same thing of a translation?
I think even more so. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it applies to any kind of writing, that whenever I reread even a bit of prose that I've written, I think, oh, I kind of want to mess with that and kind of want to mess with that. But with the translation, there's this whole extra thing of, am I fully reflecting that feature of the original that you're sort of constantly wrestling with? And there's never a finished answer to that. I mean, it's like the line about Saturday Night Live, that it doesn't start because it's ready, it starts because it's 11:30.
And do you sometimes, having changed a line or a word in a subsequent reprint, feel that you did the wrong thing?
So I actually so I published the Odyssey translation with the sort of every single review went on about what I did with the beginning, with tell me about a complicated man, Muse, tell me how he wandered, and all that. And I agonized about that, partly because everyone else seemed to be agonizing about it. And I spent about a month doing a rewrite of the proem of the Odyssey, and I sent it to the publisher and said, maybe I want to change the whole thing. And he said, no, you've ruined it. It's terrible. You need to stick with what you had. It's iconic now.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
and I think
one's editor really works.
I think you can keep, I don't know. The 10th guess is sometimes the right one. I don't know. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you, by the way, do you think in American English is a foreign language to you? Is it a native language to you? Who is your audience? Is your audience both sides of the Atlantic? Is it an American audience that is reading?
That's a great question. I mean, that's related to the trust your editor thing, because I have an American editor and Norton publishes both sides of the Atlantic and in Europe, but it's primarily American. I try not to use sort of definitely Britishisms, but I don't always know what they are. And the American editor has caught several of them. I mean, I remember there was a review of my Odyssey translation that talked about the word scalawag, which the reviewer thought was a Southern American word, but I'd originally written scallywag, which is a Britishism. And the editor had said, no, that's not, you can't use scallywag, you have to use scalawag. And I really agonized about it. It doesn't seem like a word I would ever use. I would always say scallywag. I think I'm trying to write for a readership who I hope exists on both sides of the Atlantic and even in Australia. But of course, there is no such language as mid-Atlantic English. So there are always these compromises. And very often I've sort of come up with an idiom which I think sort of works. And then I get told either that's too British or I don't quite know what that means, or I mean, like the word reckon also. I think of the word reckon as a very normal word, but it's apparently not a very normal word for an American to use.
Well, not Americans today, but Twain uses it all the time.
Yes, of course. I mean, it's a very normal 19th century word, but it sounds retro, I guess.
How has your English, how many years have you been in the United States?
I think 30 years, something like that. I came when I was in my mid-20s to do my PhD at Yale.
And how has your language changed? You have been longer in the United States than you were in England.
Almost the same, but yes, a little bit longer in the US now, yes. Yeah. I mean, I have teenage daughters, so I'm constantly trying to learn new language because there's so many phrases that I don't know that come from TikTok language. I'm not going to put those in a poetic translation of Homer, but I'm fascinated by them. I mean, I'm fascinated by the way that language is changing so quickly in that generation of the under 20-year-olds who are, making up new phrases and new slang on social media. And part of the goal of slang is that it's always going to be sort of out of date to the people who are even 5 years older. Like that's old school talk, and it's amazing.
Now, and Caitlin introduced you that way too, but it has been repeated many times. You're the first woman to translate the Odyssey. It's a very long tradition of men who have been translating the Odyssey. I have so many questions around this. The first one is that a responsibility that was heavy in your mind or on your shoulders when you were embarking on this project? Is it something that you even paid attention? Maybe you but the real question here for me is, do you think men and women translate differently? Of course, every individual translates differently. There's no two translations that are alike, because and every individual translates differently within their life, because, as you said, the language changes. But is there a disposition, particularly with a book like the Iliad, that is so much about war and so much about soldiers, and is there talk to me about being a woman in pouring that aspect, that sensibility, if it is something that you did, into the job of the translation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a difficult question because I don't want to claim that gender doesn't matter at all for any interpretative work. But my first response is no, I didn't really think about it at all. I mean, I'd had to think about it because, of course, the publishers, before the Odyssey came out, were starting to say, this is going to be a big headline because this is going to be part of our marketing strategy. And it wasn't part of, what my approach to the poem. I mean, I'd never really thought about the Odyssey in terms of my gender. I thought, I thought, for decades that the Homeric poems are interested in gender among so many other social categories. I think they're interesting in their representations of gender, partly because they have so many interesting characters who are very powerful who are female, as well as so many characters who are disempowered who are female. I mean, there's no sort of clean line of sort of creating non-intersectional accounts of gender in Homer. It doesn't make any sense, given that Hera and Athena are pushing for slaughter as much as any mortal man is, and they're more successful with it than any mortal man could be. I don't know. I mean, I tend to think it's so much more complicated than the First Woman headlines. And I mean, I also want to say that Caroline Alexander published a translation of the Iliad in 2015 into English. 400 years ago, Anne Dacier translated both Homeric poems into French prose. In the Italian tradition, there were multiple translations into free verse by women, like Rosa Oneste is still like one of the most commonly read Italian translations of Homer. Do they have anything in particular in common with my approach? I don't think they do. I think if you sort of set side by side, you don't know, this is in Dutch, this is in Italian, this is in French, this is in English, which ones are by women. There's no way you could pick them out if you didn't have any prior knowledge. So I think that's a way of sort of doing a test of, do women translate differently? No, probably not. I mean, I think there might be things you could say if you had a larger sample size, but we don't have a very large sample size. And I mean, is it the case that all women choose to use regular meter or iambic pentameter? Obviously not. It doesn't have anything to do with it.
I was mentioning at the beginning how much I admire one of the books that your mother, Catherine Duncan Jones, wrote on Shakespeare, The Ungentle Life. And I was thinking I was rereading the book when I was reading your translations, kind of breaking the generational divide. I don't remember exactly the passage, Emily, but there is something about Romeo and Juliet that your mother says. And one of the things that I admire so much about Shakespeare is his capacity, and this I say as a man, of being able to fully understand the complexity of being a female character or a male character, as if there was no barrier. It doesn't always happen with other men. There are writers like Philip Roth, seems to me, that can do very well men, very poorly women. So I wonder if, as a woman, you can give me your assessment of how Homer does women.
Yeah, I don't know quite what to say to that, because I mean, part of the place I want to go to is, how does Homer do goddesses? And I don't know how it is to be a goddess. I'm not immortal, so I actually can't comment on that. And I do think that, the Iliad, does it give us as fully the perspective of Briseis as it does of Achilles? Absolutely not. No. I mean, we get some insight into what does it feel like to be Briseis, but we don't have anything like the sense of her complete sort of history and emotional perspective that we do about Achilles. And we don't get to see Briseis interacting with anyone who she really cares about in the way that we do with Achilles with Patroclus or his mother. We get to see, in Andromache's interaction with Hector, we get to see how terrified she is at the prospect that their baby is going to be flung from the city walls and she's going to be enslaved. And it's going to be because of the choices that her husband is making in the course of this conversation by refusing to listen to her military strategy suggestions. But does that mean we understand her as a woman, or do we just understand how frightening it is to lose everything? I'm not sure if it's fully gendered. I mean, I think it's anyone of any gender can be frightened of having your child killed or having the prospect of the total devastation of your city. So I guess I sort of hesitate to think gender is at the forefront of everything. And I tend to think it's not. I mean, obviously within the Homeric poems, there are ways that the society, the mortal societies of both Troy and the Greek encampment, are completely organized on lines of gender, even to the extent of, women can't express rage because there's no possibility for that to lead to anything if you're a mortal woman. But of course, if you're an immortal goddess, then you can be as angry as you like, and it's a totally different kind of situation.
No, it's somewhere in I don't remember if it's in the introduction to the Odyssey or in the introduction to the Iliad, or in both, you talk about the tools that you always have next to you when you're translating, and it's the concordances or the dictionaries. One thing I don't remember you mentioning Emily, is previous translations of these works next to you as you're preparing this. And of course, the difference between translating a contemporary text for the very first time is that there's no predecessors to mark a tradition. Whereas in the classics, yes, that stuffy word that we were talking about before, there's the constant dialogue of translators of who did well and how this. Often in proposals to publishers, it is the new translator who's saying the previous translators have not done the right job, and I'm going to be able to clean the house. So I wonder to what extent, in preparing either book, in preparing your other translations, you studied, you came close, you defined yourself by reading the previous ones, or was it better not to even take a look at them, aside from the fact that I assume that you had read them at some point in the past, but I'm talking about the actual moment of translation.
In the actual moment of translation, no, I felt it was completely useless to be looking at them, because there would be that whole thing of, here I am stuck on this particular phrase, and I can look at a couple of other translations, and then I've made my problem worse, because I have to then decide, do I steal this, or do I realize, okay, all the options I've already thought of have been used, and none of them have actually worked very well. I mean, that doesn't help me. What helps me is just keeping on wrestling with it. I mean, certainly you're right that I've taught Homer in translation, to undergraduates, and I've used multiple different translations. I've of course had to do a book proposal for both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and in the course of doing that, of course, I did have to. I mean, I actually wouldn't have signed up to the Odyssey at all if I hadn't done this process of sort of combing through like a dozen existing translations and sort of figuring out, do I think the world needs this? Is there already something out there that does exactly what I would do? In which case, like, why am I signing up for 6 years of labor on something which is reinventing the wheel? So I did that work, but I didn't do that work on a daily basis while I was working on either the Odyssey or the Iliad. In fact, I looked a tiny bit more at other translations for the Iliad than for the Odyssey, because I was constantly. With the Iliad, there were far more names. The glossary is sort of 3 times as long for the Iliad as for the Odyssey, because, of course, it's a poem that's all about male social networks that are defined by the names of your fathers and your comrades, and this is who he killed, and this is who he killed, and this is who he killed, and it's a long list of names. And that, because I was using a very regular meter, part of why the reason I signed up at all is because most of the modern translations are not metrical. And I thought that's something I think the reader should have available in an English contemporary translation, is a metrical Homer. But then where exactly do we think the stress is? Is it idomenia? So is it idomeneus? So is it Diomedes, or is it Diomedes? So I went back and looked at the 18th and 19th century metrical translations occasionally. And every time I did that, I thought, this is completely useless, because the English language has changed since the 18th century. So me knowing how William Cooper puts the stress doesn't actually help me at all. So every time I did that, I did it several times, especially with the catalogue of ships. I would go back and sort of check on.
Did you translate the 24 books in order? Do you translate backwards, in the middle? What's your process, and at what time of day do you do the translations?
Yes, so I tend to be a morning person, so as early as possible. I mean, sometimes I would sort of get up really, really early, like before my kids are up, but certainly morning is my best time for working. I find I get more tired, and I sometimes I try to work at night, but I'm not as sharp as I can do reading at night, but for the writing and translation kind of work, morning. So with both the Odyssey and the Iliad, I translated more or less book by book, but somewhat out of order. Partly because with the Iliad, we were going to be using just a few books for the anthology of world literature. So I had to get the sort of much anthologized books had to get done first. And then I went back and revised. So of course, book 1 was the one I revised the most, because I started with it.
And do you paid enormous attention to the oral, the musicality of even in the lists of names, the musicality. And I when I read your translation and when I read your reflections on the music of those names, it made me think of the long portions in the Bible, in the book of Genesis or in the book of Exodus, that might seem simply like another list of this family, but it is the echoes and the tones, and that do you, once you settle on a section, do you read it out loud? How do you play? How do you listen to it? I'm sure as a translator, I do myself when I translate Neruda's poetry, I am listening to my own words, but then I read them or I read them to others and see where I stumble or don't stumble, what would be more agile. How do you play with the tension between the oral? This book started as orality and then moved to the written form.
I do exactly the same thing. I do a lot of reading out loud. I mean, mostly at first I do a lot of reading out loud just, to myself or to my pets who aren't going to complain about it if it's bad. So I do a lot of reading out loud of the original and sort of trying to figure out where is the alliteration most dense, where does the Homeric poetry is all in regular dactylic hexameter, was all almost all the time experienced as oral performance texts in antiquity. I want those qualities to be audible in the translations. I want the translations to invite reading out loud as the original poems do. So I would, I very often start with writing by hand and reading out loud the drafts I've got, and then I realize this line didn't work, this line didn't work, this line didn't work, and I change it, I keep on changing it till I feel I can read it out loud and it has some kind of energy that echoes whatever the energy is that I'm hearing in the original.
And you've read the audio version too?
Nope, I am a ham it up, enthusiastic but terrible reader. So no, I'm very lucky that they managed to hire real actors to do the audiobooks. Audra McDonald does the Iliad. I think she does an amazing job. So it's real, famous actors with real acting skills, unlike me.
Now, I know you have a little section of what are you going to read first, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, with a little bit of the original too, whatever you, just to give people a sense of how it sounds in your voice and how the original sounds in your voice as well.
Yes, which one should I do first? Okay, maybe, should I start with the Odyssey? Because I did that first. I'll start with the Odyssey. Okay. I'm going to read just a tiny bit of the original, and then I'm going to read, this is when Odysseus is back on Ithaca in book 19 of the Odyssey, and he's talking to Penelope, who doesn't realize who he is yet. So he's telling her all these lies about who he is, and he's, in disguise. Isque pseudia polla lecone tu moisi homoia, tes deracus accuses redacroa, tecete decros, hoste hion cateteceten acropol loisinoresin, henturos catetexen, epen zephyros catecue. Okay, I'm going to read my translation of that passage. His lies were like the truth, and as she listened, she began to weep. Her face was melting, like the snow that Zephyr scatters across the mountain peaks. Then Eurus thaws it, and as it melts, the rivers swell and flow again. So were her lovely cheeks dissolved with tears. She wept for her own husband, who was right next to her. Odysseus pitied his grieving wife inside his heart, but kept his eyes quite still, without a flicker, like horn or iron, and he hid his tears with artifice. She cried a long, long time.
Would you read us the...
Then Iliad, yes. So I wanted to make sure I have a contrasting passage. So this is we had a domestic scene. This is when hostilities break out in book 4 between the Greeks and the Trojans. Hoi deres coron henasun iontos iconto, sun hebelon rinus, sun denkia caimena andron, calce othoru con, at araspides omphaloesai, eplet adlelesi, polustor rorugmanos orure. I'm going to read the translation of a little bit longer than that. Once they were gathered in a single place, they clashed together, shields of leather, spears, bronze-armored bodies, and fierce human will. Their shields collided, and the metal bosses clanged in cacophony. On every side, men shouted out in agony and triumph, killing and being killed. The earth was flooded with blood, as when, from two opposing mountains, from mighty springs, two river torrents, swollen by winter storms, flow down the deep ravines, then clash, collide, and mingle in the gorge, creating an enormous flood. The shepherd, high on the hilltop, hears the waters roar. Such was the noise of fighting and of screaming as those two armies met.
Emily, a bunch of questions now completely about different kind of the minutiae of translation. How do you define the word bombast that we were playing before?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've used it and reviewers have used it, and I'm not I feel like it's good to zero in on it because I mean, in some ways, the passage I just read from the Iliad, I think it has to be bombastic. I mean, This is a really intense moment. I mean, I think it can connote a sort of excess, a linguistic excess that doesn't fully match what's going on, right? I mean, when you're sort of overwriting a scene that doesn't actually need quite as many linguistic fireworks as it has. So I think it can connote something where, you know, the language is at a higher pitch than the action. I think in the Iliad, the action is usually at a very high pitch, and therefore it actually doesn't necessarily, to me, feel bombastic to pull out some linguistic stops and to sort of say, I need a lot of alliteration to get the clash of cacophony or the cataclysmic wrath. So I don't necessarily think of that as bombast exactly. I think of it as high style, and I want to be able to have some version of something very intense happening linguistically to match something very intense happening in terms of, you know, how do people feel and how, you know, what are the feelings?
And of course, what you've been celebrated for and what you seem to be very committed to is in kind of undressing I don't know if that is the right metaphor, peeling off the layers of seriousness and formal language that previous translators have brought through the successive efforts and in the centuries, and make it much more accessible and immediate and urgent. You started with that from the very beginning. You started with that. That was going to be your legacy from the very beginning, even before you started the first work.
No, I mean, I think to me, it's been very odd, and also kind of, I mean, in a way, I'm grateful for that reception, because of course, people are much more likely to buy a translation if the marketing says this is easy to read and it's fun, whereas if the marketing says this is full of pretentious poetic artifice, then, you know, you might get, my sales might be less good. My sales are great, but I'm grateful but as I said before, like my primary goal was to use regular meter, and it seems to me that, you know, the best-selling translations before mine were the Robert Fagles, which are in free verse and use far more American cliches and colloquialisms than I do, and it seems to me that in a way those translations, I can see why those could be sold as, this is trying to be accessible and speaking your language, you American reader. I don't see myself as quite doing that. I mean, I'm very glad if readers find it readable, because of course, like, who am I writing for if not for, you know, the potential readers? Yep. But that's not really, I mean, I want it not to be unclear. And I think Homeric poetry is always very clear. It's always very direct emotionally, and it's in terms of what exactly is the action, what's going on. I mean, I love Milton, and I love the subordinate clauses in Paradise Lost. The Homeric poems are nothing like that. So I wanted to be very clear, this is a kind of epic that is exciting and thrilling and often grand, but it's not, here's another subordinate clause, here's another subordinate clause, and I have kind of lost track of where the main verb is, but here's a main verb coming up in about 5 minutes. It's not like that in Homer. It's very, very clear, and this happens, this happens.
I want to encourage listeners, we're coming close to the wrapping up the conversation, and I have many more questions to ask, but I would love to invite people to put their comments and questions in the Q&A section, and I will go to them as soon as I ask 2 or 3 more questions. Meaning, the first one, Emily, is this. Ezra Pound, with whom I have a very ambivalent relationship as a reader, once said that only a poet can translate poets. You wrestle with this throughout your introduction in different conversations that you've given. You are not a poet, but you play with the iambic pentameter. Your interest is to bring the poetry back. Was he wrong?
I don't think he's necessarily wrong. I mean, I think the question of who is a poet, who gets to count as a poet, I mean, that's a very loaded question, right? I mean, I'm an amateur, very bad poet. I think translation brings out my capacity to write verse in a way that, I struggle. I write bad poetry that I'm never going to publish, but I'm not going to say I'm a capital P poet, but I also really care about poetry, and I care about poetic form and poetic technique. I don't know if Pound would count me as far as allowed to do this, but I also, I've read Pound's Propertius, and I also think you need to understand the original as well. I don't know.
Now, there's a section in the intro to the Iliad, I mentioned this at the beginning, where you say that you have no experience whatsoever in war or as a soldier, and that in order to do your due diligence, you talked to different soldiers, you watched videos. You tell us a little bit about that way of immersing yourself. And maybe I'll also anchor here, Emily, there's a moment in where you also mentioned the fact that 2 American soldiers might relate to one another as buddies.
Yes, sir.
But you are you restrain yourself, and you are looking for alternatives here so that the language feels immediate and urgent, but it doesn't get cheapened by, I don't know if that's the right term, but by the daily life of today in America.
Yeah, I wrestle with that a lot. I mean, obviously it arose with the Iliad in a different way with the Odyssey, though, of course, I think I used the term veteran in the Odyssey translation. The Odyssey is also about the experience of men in war and of the families left behind by the men who go to war. There was a production of a play version of the Odyssey that I'd sort of done a sort of radically cut down version that could be staged, that was performed partly by veteran actors. And it was really moving to me to see the performance of Odysseus, the veteran, by somebody who was himself a veteran. And he was performing the text with tears in his eyes. The pain of the experience of homecoming, and the question of whether he could relate to his wife and family or be recognized as the same person, whether he was the same person or not. I also did a whole talk back with him and other veterans. And I mean, part of what I got both from that and from these various other veteran groups and talks that I've done and conversations I've had with both cadets at West Point and veteran soldiers is just awareness that Homer really speaks to these people, and those poems speak to those people partly because they don't simplify the experience of war. I mean, the pain of what is it like to be a warrior? There's an element of glorification, but there's also such a clear element of the grief and the rage and also the practical difficulties of what do we do with dead bodies, which, I mean, that came up in one of the veterans group conversations I did of all these different veterans from different wars talking about how nobody in their civilian life in sort of daily American discourse or even pop culture had prepared them for encountering dead bodies. But Homer gave them a language to talk about it. So, I mean, in a way, it just sort of brought home to me that there's something really valuable about translating these poems into clear language that conveys the complexity. I mean, I think that part of what I think about all the time is this sort of dynamic between clarity and complexity, that if you use really clear language that conveys how difficult the emotions are, how difficult the interactions are, people can see the layers. Whereas if you use language which is difficult on a surface level, where you sort of say, and then the ye olde maidens ye did, something which comes, out of Chaucer, then people may not quite understand what's being said. And then you don't get to the more interesting kind of complexity about what's going on between Odysseus and Penelope, or how exactly does Achilles feel in this scene about how is his grief entangled with his rage.
I have a couple of other questions, but time is running out as usual, and it's fitting that we're talking about Homer in connection with time. And I have a few questions that I want to read from the people who are listening. The first one, Emily, is just a comment. Who knew that a classicist would be so personable?
Oh, how sweet of you.
Here's the question. Are there phrases in either your Homeric translations that you are particularly proud of? How do they differ from other translations, and what informed your interpretation?
Oh, this is such a difficult, I don't know. I mean, I feel like that my answer to that sort of changes every day depending on, which bit I've looked back on or which bit I've done that day. I mean, as we were saying before, whenever I look back on a particular passage, I very often both have lines and phrases that I'm proud of and lines that I think, oh, I wish I could mess with that. I wish I could change something. I mean, I think part of what I'm always struck by when I look back on my work is I am proud of how I try to pay something. This is sort of trying to bring up something we haven't talked about, is trying to pay attention to metaphor. So I in the case of the Iliad, the whole sequence of metaphors that have to do with the limbs unraveling, that whole set of metaphors for death, and also the phrasing of Achilles as he's swift-footed Achilles, but he's also ocumoros, he's swift-destinied or swift-deathed, and the ways that I sort of try to make sure the metaphors, which I think are quite alien, they're not necessarily sort of conventional metaphors, they're living metaphors that are audible, I hope, in the translation. So I've noticed that some translators of Homer, and of course this applies to other texts too, do more domesticizing of metaphor than I try to do, and I feel proud of the moments where I feel I've managed to convey an alien metaphor so that it can land with a reader who obviously isn't a native reader of Homeric Greek, which nobody is.
Here's another question, Emily. What do you think of Pat Barker's novels based on the Iliad from the perspective of Briseus, The Silence of Girls and The Women of Troy?
I love the beginning of Silence of the Girls. I think it's a really powerful sort of reframing of the Iliad story. So for people who haven't read it, it's a retelling of the story largely from Briseus's perspective. I kind of felt that the novel was flawed in its handling a point of view, because she sort of shifts around so that we also get Achilles third person, and I felt there could have been a sort of tighter control over the narrative. But I felt she's a novelist who sort of made her career in historical fiction centered on 20th century war stories, and you can sort of see the 20th century sensibility of realism about what is it like with living with the rats, living with the plague, living with the corporeality of so many sick and wounded bodies to tend to, and the pain of that. And also I love the sort of invitation to rethink what in a way is the most famous scene in the Iliad, the meeting of Priam and Achilles, where Priam says, I have done what no man before me has ever done. I have put my mouth to the hands that killed my son, killed so many of my sons, the son-killing hands of Achilles. Priam presses with his lips. And in Silence of the Girls, Briseus comments, I've done what so many women have done. I've opened my legs to the rapist who killed my family. And I think that's a really powerful reframing, because you were asking before about how much does the Iliad give us the perspectives of women? It doesn't quite take us there. It doesn't quite take us to the rape and to the full experience of enslavement.
Now, we talked about your mother being a scholar and her work on Shakespeare. Your father was a biographer and a novelist. Did you ever toy with the idea of before or during being in a career as a translator? You talked about writing back poetry and not publishing it, and maybe there's the sublimation there that you become a poet through your translations. But being a fiction writer, since we were talking about Pat Parker, or a writer of any other kind, at any point did you entertain those?
I'm actually, so right now, because I finished the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there's no more Homeric poems unless I do the hymns. So I'm, which maybe I will do. Maybe I'll do some more. Maybe I'll do Apollonius. But right now I'm having a go at doing a version of that. I'm doing some fictional retellings of the myths about the Trojan War that don't make it center stage in the Iliad and the Odyssey, because of course the Iliad is such a weird poem in how much it leaves out, and part of the wonderful artistry of this poem is leaving out most of the story of the Trojan War. So I'm going to do what I'm doing right now is the in a way kind of clunky but totally enjoyable thing of spelling out, here are all the stories, and here's what it felt like to be Ganymede, here's what it felt like to be Hesione, who was the first Trojan War was the war of Heracles against Troy. So I'm doing a fictional retelling of all that stuff, and I'm having a lot of fun.
This is a perfect moment to ask you this question. I'm a scholar of Don Quixote, and I have translated parts of Don Quixote into English and into Spanglish. And there is a famous episode in the history of translating Don Quixote into different languages, in this case, French in particular, where a 19th century translator got so enamored, so obsessed, so hypnotized by the adventures of Don Quixote and Sancho that refused to translate the very last few chapters where Don Quixote dies, and they decided to write another book that would be as an appendix attached, where there's another adventure that Don Quixote does going out. Fortunately, he died before he completed it. For many years, the readers did not know that Don Quixote dies at the very end. The temptation to retouch, to expand, to do quietly or not so quietly what other readers would like to do more openly. Do you feel that temptation? You talk about the core text and then sometimes deviating from that core original classical Greek, and then putting footnotes or making comments on that. But a little more adventurous on that?
I don't feel the need to mess with it, because I feel there's so many opportunities to use power text to do that work. I mean, of course, many people, I love that story about Don Quixote. I mean, many people have done that with, I mean, there's the famous 13th book of the Aeneid, where obviously the Aeneid ends with a cliffhanger, and throughout the medieval tradition, people wanted to have a 13th book because it's a better ending. In the case of the Odyssey, many people in antiquity felt the best way to edit this is just to cut off book 24, because then you can end with the happy ending of Odysseus and Penelope. And when I think when I first read the Odyssey, I felt that way. I felt, whoa, why do we end with back to slaughtering? This seems like a really weird place to end. I feel more and more that I like the way the Homeric poems end the way they are. And I also think there's so much room for doing other stuff with those stories, and including both scholarly critical materials, and I went a little bit more crazy with the footnotes in the Iliad and the Odyssey because they let me. There's a lot of room for writing essays about these poems, and also for writing fiction and thinking through other things you can do with these characters. But I don't think it has to be presented as translation. I think that's the way of, I think you need to be upfront about what you're doing.
Here's another question from Ben Fisher. I'm sorry I haven't read the ones prior to this. They mentioned the names. When you translate and teach the Odyssey, how do you approach the topic of slavery, especially for students? In translation, what went into your decision to use the word slave where others like Fagles did not?
I think this is part of my desire to be clear about what the text is saying and doing. I don't think that the translation should obscure something that's not obscure in the original, or wouldn't have been obscure for an ancient reader. So in the case of the Homeric poems, I mean, so in the Odyssey, the Demooi or Demoai, the domestic enslaved people in the household, the oikos of Odysseus, there's no ambiguity about their status. They're not presented as hired people who could go home anytime they like. They don't have a home. And the fact that there's a lot of characters, including named characters, like Eurycleia, who don't have a home. I think it's really important for understanding what is this poem's depiction of its central theme of both xenia, of hospitality, of welcoming others into your home, and of nostos, of homecoming, which is a privileged possibility for somebody who isn't enslaved and has this capacity to move between homes and to reclaim his own home. So I felt that I would be obscuring something that's really essential to the poem if I'm not clear about this is a poem about a society where the protagonist is an enslaver, and there are some of these characters who are enslaved. They're not maidservants or hired people, they're enslaved. Yeah.
Great. Another question here, how do you recommend getting high school students through the door, as you were describing before? In this case, high school students. In other words, I'm assuming, and I'm editorializing here, how do we get middle schoolers, but particularly high schoolers, excited about the classics, about Homer in particular?
Yeah, I think it partly depends on which, what's your students' backgrounds, what kinds of class is this? Is it a big class, a small class? How well do you know them? Do they have any choice about it? I mean, so much of pedagogy actually depends on the setup you've got to start with, and the background of the students. I mean, I think clarity to start with, I think, is really important. I mean, both clarity about expectations, not making the text or the stories more difficult than they need to be, not sort of adding extra layers of obscurantism just for the sake of it, and also not adding a sense of, this is magical and high status, so we need to bow down before it rather than engage with it. I mean, it seems to me that students of any age, or readers of any age, want to have a conversation and want to be able to ask questions both about the text, about each other, like how did you feel about when he did that, or what happened in that scene, but also be able to ask questions of the text. I mean, not have the text itself be set up either by the teacher or by the translator in such a way that it's sort of presented as this is on a pedestal and all we can do is bow down before it. I mean, I think that there are things that the translation itself and also the instructor or teacher can do to sort of say, whatever your thoughts are, they're all valid. Whatever your questions are, they're all valid. And we can start from wherever your questions are, we can start from those.
Yeah. Emily, and I have one last question coming back to the topic of your relationship with the English language. But before I ask you this question, as a non-native English speaker, I was born and raised in Mexico, and English is my fourth language. I love what you've done with the language. I've loved what you've done with Homer in these two books, and it feels refreshing and it feels powerful, and it's an invitation to read the previous translations. And here is the question, and I'm very grateful to you and excited to have been in conversation. Here's the question to you. All those previous translations have something that yours doesn't have, and that is the passage of time. They have been sitting in libraries, opened or not, and a testament of how their age, their epoch looked at translation, look at Homer. How do you foresee your translations aging in the next 10, 20 years? The freshness that you have here might disappear. What is it? Is that the plight of any translation anyhow, to just live in the moment?
I mean, I think every text is going to read differently in 10 or 20 years from how it reads right now. I mean, even assuming that people are still reading epic poetry in 20 years, which, I hope that there are enough humans on this planet who are, healthy enough to be able to be enjoying reading Homer and talking about it. I don't think it's really my job to agonize about that too much. I mean, I think, I love the older translations. I love Chapman from 400 years ago, even though, of course, his Greek wasn't at a level that a contemporary scholar could be, because he didn't have the resources that a contemporary classicist could have. But I think it's, a wonderful, document of Jacobean poetry. I think I write both with an eye to readers right now, and I hope there are ways that it will still be legible and enjoyable for readers in a few decades. I mean, I hope there's a kind of, I mean, I'm trying not to use too much totally up to the minute slang that my daughter taught me yesterday, because I think that's probably not going to be cool anymore with the 13-year-olds of 30 years from now. So I try to avoid that. But, you know, I think there's no possible way to predict how the English language or how the life experience of English speakers is going to be different. I mean, obviously we know some things, but it's going to be very different. And, you know, I think the least of our worries is whether people are going to read me.
Well, muchas gracias, as we say in Spanish.
Muchas gracias a ti.
What a joy. And I'll be waiting on this side of the page for the next translation or the next version. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. It was really fun to talk to you. Thank you, all the audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. There were a bunch of questions that we didn't have time for, but read the translations and come back next time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.